I didn't sleep for several months and I wasn't particularly in a good state, and we had to reconfigure the touchscreen to be operated left-handed.
G'day guys, I just had a chat with former ABC election analyst Antony Green, and it was super interesting, so we'll dive straight into it. Enjoy. Antony, to start us off, you've described yourself as, you're a political scientist first and a journalist second. How has that shaped your relationship with, I guess, newsroom culture and on-air expectations, but also taking into account your expertise?
I must say, one of the things I tend to do is that, working very closely with electoral commissions, you rely on a lot of information from them. And I'm always a bit cautious about maintaining a trust with the electoral commissions. I think it's important not to, if one small error occurs, not to blow it out of proportion in terms of bringing into disrepute the electoral system. The electoral system relies, and its operation and the electoral commissions rely very much on public trust, and to sort of throw that trust into doubt by pointing to one small error, which sometimes occurs, sometimes they occur, I think is a bad thing. So, but sometimes that doesn't connect with news values. Now, I have no involvement in day-to-day news. When there's an election on, I'm involved in the election coverage. I mean, along with decisions on the night. And the post-election period, I've looked after the computer system and how it works. Traditionally, that didn't involve me in having much to do with news on the days that followed. That's changed a lot in the last 5 years, because increasingly people want rolling news, where, I mean, people were seriously following the Bradfield recount on an hourly basis, which was, like, to me, a complete waste of time. So to some senses, it's quite glad to walk away from that, because the whole thing is becoming much more of something which is rolling news and breathless reporting of what's happened in the last hour. That's more of a reflection of where news has gone. Reporting news on an hourly basis was just unimaginable 15 years ago. It would have all been for the evening news bulletin or morning radio bulletins, but news has changed, so I'm quite happy to be out of that a little bit.
Yeah, well, it's funny you say that, because I wanted to show you this, and just to sort of get your thoughts / reflections. This is the 1972 federal election coverage.
Yes.
And there was something that really entertained me and my editor about it. Hopefully this works with sound.
To help us in our analysis, the Customs Department has lent us their $2 million ICL computer, which we're feeding direct from the tally room. But more about that later. Here's Bob Moore and the commentators.
Obviously, things have changed quite a deal since then. I was curious to know, do you think that there are things that we could still take from those days when it comes to election coverage into what we do now, or even just electoral reporting?
No, not on election night. The figures it's completely different now. In 1990, the feed was augmented to include the numbers of polling places. In 1993, the Commission went one step further and for the first time did indicative preference counts in every polling place. And the feed came through to us with both preference counts and the polling place information. That was my first one on camera, and we called Keating's election quite early because we had that data. Now, the systems have gone on to be much more complex since. We now get all polling place results. There's a lot more data and a lot more processing, and the system isn't quite as two-party preferred as it used to be. In those days, it was easier. I mean, if anyone watched a little tribute to me at the end of election night last year, there was all these shots of me drawing a chamber and saying how many seats had been won and then making a prediction. We've stopped using that prediction because it's become unreliable for a variety of different reasons to the way voting and counting has changed since then. Basically, the introduction of pre-poll voting has made it much more difficult to be certain from polling places.
Do you think as pre-poll grows in popularity and I guess preference and makeup of that vote share, do you think that will eventually almost see the death of the one night election coverage, event?
It is getting very difficult for the Commission to count all the votes on the night. As well as staffing all the polling places, and polling places are staffed to a level that will also count the votes. So that's the staffing level for polling places. Pre-poll votes are completely separate. I mean, they have to be extra staff brought in to do the count. Now, at the moment, they have changed the rules so they can open the ballot boxes at 4 o'clock to sort ballot papers, to sort of put them in rough piles. They're not allowed to count them till 6, and they're not allowed to open the envelope that says the indicative preference counts till 6. But that's a change they've made to try and get everything counted by 10. But there are serious problems with occupational health and safety, having people standing around tables for hour after hour, particularly in polling places, to, after 10 o'clock, counting all these ballot papers, doing indicative preference counts and counting Senate ballot papers.
You mentioned some moments that you were quite proud of. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it was calling Keating's 93 re-election, despite contradictory graphics. Calling Family First's Victorian Senate win in 2004. I guess for you, is there something about being the one that reveals that a trend has been bucked that is exciting? Is there something to that?
The elections I always remember are the ones which were a bit unexpected. So Keating in 93 was one, Nick Griner's surprisingly narrow victory in 91 in New South Wales, Jeff Kennett's defeat in 99, what was the other? Campbell Newman's defeat in 2015 in Queensland. That just came from nowhere and was just extraordinary. So some of those stick in your mind. It was easier to call those ones in the early days. It was easier to call Keating's. The data was very consistent in those days. You used to get 80% on the night. We had the polling places, the two-party preferred counts. More recently, like the Campbell Newman one, that was occurring in so many seats, and there were so many possibilities that the model we had in all those seats might not have been correct, that you just had to sit there and saying, Labor's very close to victory, but I mean, really, we need to go through each of these seats with a fine-tooth comb.
I was going to say, after a 36-year career, is there one moment that still either surprises you or kind of still shocks you when you think back on it?
I mean, look, the one that still stands out for me above all else was just 2015 in Queensland. I'd had a shoulder reconstruction over the Christmas holidays, and then Campbell Newman called the election to the end of January, and so I didn't sleep for several months, and I wasn't particularly in a good state, and we had to reconfigure the touchscreen to be operated left-handed. And so, there I was with a lack of sleep, not a lot of space off camera for anyone to help me, trying to figure out where this wave was going to finish at the end of the night. It was that was probably the most memorable one I've ever worked on.
You've done some recent analysis on, I'll just call it the One Nation situation at the moment. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but your analysis sort of suggests that their vote is very concentrated in just a number of seats rather than this broad nationwide appeal that seems to be the narrative that's kind of going forward at the moment.
Yeah, look, as a comparison, the Nationals get 6% of the vote and 15 seats. The Greens get 12% and 1. And the reason is simply that the national vote is concentrated in a small number of seats, all rural, which it can get a majority in. And the Greens vote tends to be evenly distributed across the country, not concentrated enough to deliver too many victories. One Nation's vote, if you go looking back at the history of the party's support, it's always stronger in country areas. It's always stronger in Queensland. If One Nation is polling 20, 25% in national polls, it is scoring 35, 40, 45 in parts of rural New South Wales, and all of rural Queensland. So that's what a high One Nation vote means. Now, if they don't get above 40, then you can get preferences play a part in them not winning seats. But essentially, if One Nation is getting 20 to 25% of the vote, they are winning seats. And if they win seats, it's almost always going to be off the National Party, to a lesser extent the Liberal Party, than maybe a small number of Labor seats.
And you've also mentioned that the Victorian election will be very interesting to tell us about where Australian politics is going. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think the next 3 elections will be huge pointers to the next federal election. South Australia in March. If One Nation outpoll the Liberal Party, there will be political earthquakes across the country. It is expected that Labor will win easily down there. Is their vote going to be affected by One Nation? And as seems to be, as is expected, how badly the Liberal Party do and how badly they do in relation to One Nation. Victoria is a 12-year-old government. It's a government which is a bit on the nose in different parts of the electorate. It's an electorate, a state where the Labor Party vote. Look, the Liberal Party haven't won a seat west or north of the Yarra in Melbourne since the turn of the century. But the Labor Party vote has been sort of drifting away in those areas, west, particularly west of the Yarra, out towards Melton. But the Liberal Party haven't been able to capitalise on it. Now, if One Nation capitalise on it, that opens a whole new area of expansion for One Nation, seats that the Labor Party holds that they would be a threat in. And that hasn't been a problem for the Labor Party since the very first One Nation election in Queensland in 1998. So that's why I think Victoria is very interesting. The National Party down there is probably more grassroots and better connected with its communities than the branches in other states. So it's interesting to see how One Nation does do in Victoria. It's never done well in Victoria. It's got one upper house MLC at the moment, but it's never done particularly well in Victoria. Is it going to do that this time? There was a lot of breakout of small right-wing parties at the last election, anti-Dan Andrews, anti-lockdown stuff, and that had some resonance, and the preferences from those parties was one of the reasons why the last Victorian election was one of the few elections where Labor didn't win many seats from behind on preferences. One Nation could sweep up that. And of course, with the ongoing organisational difficulties the Liberal parties had with chopping and changing leaders and suing each other, this created serious problems for the Liberal Party trying to run a campaign at the next election. So that one's set up to be a measure of whether One Nation is a threat to both Labor and the Liberal Party in ahead of then the New South Wales election, where that'll be a real threat in country New South Wales for the National Party.
What do you think is the biggest misunderstanding that Australians have when it comes to how they vote and their electoral system?
The biggest thing to me is the number of people who talk about preference deals and people sending preferences. Voters control preferences. Parties can issue harder votes, and that can influence what voters does, but it's far less influential than people understand. So this lie that it's all deals and the parties direct preferences is just nonsense. And voters have got to understand, whoever you vote for, if you vote 1 for a candidate, 2 for a candidate, 3 for a candidate, that's what the Electoral Commission counts. No party or no candidate can change what the voter writes on the ballot paper. And that's a key thing that I get is constantly misrepresented.